Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Cop Talk. I'm Kevin Schroeder, your host. I'm here with my co-host, Captain Ed Mamet.
Hello, WABC listeners and YouTube viewers. Today's guest has a very varied background and is extremely interesting, and you'll hear all about him shortly.
So today's guest on Cop Talk is Hank Sheinkopf. Hank is a former Port Authority police officer. He's also owns a public relations company, and he also is a political advisor, political consultant for many people running for state office, city office, as well as the White House. Hank, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me here. I'm very grateful to be with you both this evening.
So, Hank, why don't you tell our audience a little bit about your background?
It's too complicated.
Your early background, how you started.
Your early background,
how I
where you grew up.
I'm the product of a relationship between a 15-year-old woman and a 19-year-old father. My father, before he died, asked me to come see him, and I did. He was living on the Lower East Side, and he said, there's two things I did in my life. One was good for you, and one was bad for me. I said, and what was that, Dad? He said, well, what was bad for me is I married your mother. He said, what was good for you is I didn't let them abort you. Now, I was born in Dr. Leff's hospital on the Grand Concourse. Dr. Leff, I always joked they had two entrances. One was when he allowed you to get born, and the other was, and he went away in the 60s, got locked up for doing abortions when it was illegal. So I'm very grateful that they didn't put me through the other door. I was abandoned at the age of, I guess, 6. Two brothers, we pretty much had to fend for ourselves. There was someone who came in to see us and made sure we had enough of something. And then one day I didn't live there anymore, and I got shipped to a place called the Green Chimneys, which is in Brewster, New York, with my brothers. My father was always well-intended but couldn't pay the freight. So the Ross family wound up taking me in and effectively became my family for many years. They ran the place. So I didn't have the best start, and I didn't suspect that anything good would come from it. I mean, if I had career goals at that time, there were two. One, I would either finish my 4th bid of Dannemora by now, or I would have retired from one of the jobs, either federal or state or city, picked up a pension, married someone I detested, live in a place I hated, and come home one night drunk and kill everybody. I mean, I didn't see any good coming out of my life. It was the good came much later, and it was a series of accidents. I was very fortunate.
It's quite inspirational. What about your education?
I dropped out of high school at about 15 and change. I lived with my mother and her husband for a while in between. Probably by the time I met my wife, my present wife I'm married to for 35 years. We have 2 wonderful children and better life than I ever could have imagined, and a family that I could only have dreamed of. I lived in about 20 different places. So it was, and for a couple of years I lived with my wife, I lived with my mother and her husband, second husband. He was a terror. And I went to school, junior high school, 62 in Brooklyn, because that's where they lived. With the black eyes, split lips, cops were in the house 3 nights a week. And there's a book by a fellow named Marty Cohn, who's since passed, who was a teacher at Ditmas junior high school where I was, and he said that this was the worst case of child abuse that he'd seen throughout his entire career. I went from there. They moved to Huntington. I lived there for a couple of years, and I walked out one day. I was 15. I never came back because I couldn't take it anymore, and there was no one to help me. I mean, I had nobody there was nobody in my corner. There was no one to help me. One of my brothers, Elliot, which they didn't know what to do with him, so they shipped him to Israel with $50 in his pocket, and he wound up, he wanted to come home. They wouldn't let him come back because they wouldn't give him a ticket, my father and his father. And he wound up in the Golan Heights in '73 in some of the bloodiest battles in the Yom Kippur War. A classic story, and he's never recovered from PTSD. He was the point man in his squad, and then he said, I got to get out for a second to tie his shoe. The point man who replaced him got killed right in front of him in the Golan Heights. Now, you don't recover from experiences like that. And so at best, my life was fragmented. I didn't see much purpose to it. I had to support myself from the age of, 15. I was working from the age of 12, I guess. And, I didn't see any future. I didn't think I was going anyplace. So if it hadn't been, I came back to New York City. I finished high school because the Rosses kept me and took me in again. University was free, without which I would never go into school. I was living in a basement apartment, working I learned how to be a restaurant counterman and a short order cook. And I went to school and I did that. And, I was fortunate. I was in the first class at York College, which had just opened in '67, a very different place then than it was today. And it was small, and I got to get some personal attention. But I was working, nights and going to school days, and I dropped out for a while. I had no place to live. I lived probably with friends and for a year and all over the city. I went back and finished, and then I had no idea what I was going to do with my life. So I picked up I was a unionized restaurant counterman, Local 60, which doesn't exist anymore. And I went to work behind the counter. That was the story. That's what I figured my life would be. And then fate intervened.
Well, now you're a PhD.
I am BA, MA, MPhil, PhD, the equivalent of a DD plus.
Wow.
And where did you get your PhD?
I made a decision that I would go back. I did my master's at John Jay. I'd been an investigator at the New York City Department of Correction assigned to things like I worked with Joan Chesimard was one of my favorite people, cop killer. And I worked with major case squad detectives on a daily basis in the street. Why? Because we wanted to make sure these guys stayed in the can. It was not easy. It was not pleasant. It was life-threatening. I'm glad I did it. And one day it blew up. My boss got into trouble, and I wasn't a rat. And that was the end of that. And I wanted to go on the city job, but you remember in the post-fiscal crisis years, there were no classes. So I went to the Port Authority Police, which was not my first choice. I wasn't happy, and one day I was terribly unhappy, and I was, my life wasn't going anyplace, and I knew that I had no future there whatsoever. And it wasn't what I wanted to do. I mean, I had the best job in the city as far as I was concerned, and now I had the worst job. I wanted to be back being a cop, but it wasn't going to be. And one night I was in a bar. I'd done a 4 to 12, and again, I had no family. The bar was my life. That was my social life. That was everything, And a young man who I'm grateful to every day, and I think of him often, but I never knew his name. Coming into the bar, gave me a shot to the kidneys, with his elbow. And I didn't pay attention because, who pays attention? And I went up to the end of the bar, and he knew I was a cop. And he came up with one guy on each side of him all the way up to the end of the bar. It's a bar in Brooklyn. And he reached cross-draw. And you got to remember, this is the 70s, and you guys understand this. Reached cross-draw under his coat. And I took my gun out and put it in his lower portion of his body. I said, go right ahead. I said, I'm a police officer. I'll kill you right now. And what occurred to me at the time, I was at John Jay, and I was finishing up the master's, but what occurred to me was, and why I changed my life, one of the major reasons was because if I killed him, it wouldn't have bothered me. And then I knew that I had to make a change. Because there was a chip, not that I was a violent person per se, but my life experience had made me so inured to pain that I really didn't understand how serious the situation was. I would have just acted on instinct. Now, training is one thing. And everybody who's been through this experience, whether military or policing in any way, is a highly trained person. But there's an emotional core that you go through, and that's why you guys understand, whatever the equivalent of Left Rack City is, where people have psychological assistance in the police department, is what other people go through if they're not lucky, because they don't have the luxury. And I knew then that I had to make a change in my life.
So you got your PhD from John Jay.
I got my PhD. I did my second master's at the City University Graduate Center. I got my PhD there. Why? By the time I went back to finish it, and they were kind enough to let me back because I started before. I'd been an ad maker for Bill Clinton, and I'd worked in 16 non-U.S. locales as a consultant to heads of state and campaigns all over the world. I developed something of a reputation. I'd been profiled in the Times, and Wall Street Journal had my picture on the front page, one of those line drawings, and I was somewhat well known. And I felt an obligation to this university that when I was no longer here, that whatever notoriety I'd been fortunate to have, I owed it to the city university to get my papers or whatever was left of me there, because without free education, I would have never been able to achieve anything. I have a debt to the city, and which is why I live here. I could have lived any place in the world. I lived in Washington briefly and hated it. But I have an obligation to the city, and I have very strong feelings about the city because it gave me every opportunity that just doesn't exist for many people today.
Another fascinating part of your career is you're an ordained rabbi.
Yeah.
So the
I am-
progression from rabbi to police work to consulting, it's very unusual and very interesting.
Well, I think that I was at an affair, and there was a Chabad rabbi there, and he said to me, would you like to learn to be a rabbi? And when I was a kid, it was one of the things I thought about doing, but I couldn't. I had no money to go and get that kind of education, and I had no support, emotionally or any other way. I mean, I was, again, I was living in a basement apartment. I was, doing these other things. I was a high school dropout. Where was I going? And I thought about it, and I said, why not? I mean, I believed very strongly that my survival and existence, which made no sense to me, still doesn't in many ways, was a function of belief, and that there must be a force that I don't understand that allowed me to keep going. So it made some sense. So I studied and I learned, and I was ordained, or what we call a smicha, in Orthodox thinking, in 3 years. At the same time, I finished my doctorate, which took me 4 years. So in the 3 to 4 year period, I did them both. And then I went back and got a second smicha, a second rabbinic ordination, allowing me to be an officiant at weddings, which I'm happy to do for people, and other life events.
So, Hank, when you were on a job, when you were on the Port Authority Police Department, where you were assigned and what was the years you?
I was assigned to Kennedy.
years?
I was not happy. It was boring. When I was at the Department of Correction, I had the best job in the world. I got to work with the greatest detectives. Our job was to keep the BLA people, the Black Liberation Army, who were cop killers, those who ran the job in those years, in jail to make sure they stayed in jail. I mean, the number of nights I was on the Rikers Island Bridge with detectives with our guns drawn because we got tips they were getting out. I did a security survey among the things that I was responsible for. I did a security survey of New Jersey when Joan Chesimard was shipped over there, who still got $1 million bounty on her head. And the correction officials in Jersey asked me how long did I think would it work out. I said, she'd be out here in 60 days. And she was. I mean, I knew them all, Shasha Brown, Nikki Laborde. I testified against allowing a prisoner to be moved in federal court in camera before Judge Grisey, may rest in peace, and who was moving money to try to get her out at the time. We had her in New York, and then she was in Jersey. And I met Nikki Laborde was in the elevator with me, and he went away for murdering the cop in Queens and shooting the other one, the Scarangella murder, right? The shooting, right? He looked at me, he said, Redhead, we know where you live. I said, great. It shows you how much I didn't care about things and how crazy I was. I said, that's great. I said, could you make an appointment, please? I can't see you Saturday because I'm busy, but Sunday, like between the hours of 2 and 4. He said, what are you, nuts? I said, no, I am nuts. I said, could you make that appointment? I said, could you come over because I'll put my gun in your ass, and that's the end of the story. But I resented the fact that they created disorder. I also knew some of the cops that they had shot and wounded, and I was in the street every day with the bravest people I've ever met, most of whom, unfortunately, have gone on to help God's protection. New York City detectives and people assigned to the Detective Bureau as bosses were the bravest people I'd ever met in the most extraordinary circumstances, and who I was proud to serve with. And I'm grateful that I met them.
Some great people. Hank, your current occupation today, what are you doing today?
It's an accident. I left the job, and I had no idea what I was going to do. So somehow, as usual in my life, I met somebody who knew somebody, and the next thing I knew, I was the press secretary. This is really amazing. The press secretary to the campaign of for Governor, Lieutenant Governor Marion Krupczak, who's since passed this past, I think, a week ago. We didn't get along. There was no money. I got three weeks worth of pay. The headquarters was on Madison Avenue and 53rd Street, which today is fancy, but in those years, who would want to be there in the 70s, late 70s? And I left in a huff because she talked about running as an independent against the governor. But the night before I left, I called somebody that off the cuff, who I'd done a good job, who I didn't know, working for Hugh Carey at the time, the governor. And I said, look, I'm leaving, and I want you to know that, and I think you're doing great work. And they said, sit tight. I said, whatever that means. So I went back to being a counterman, I had a union book. I went back to working. I worked on the stage, the Carnegie, you name it, 7 to 4. Nights are very hard in those places. You really work like a dog. And the pay was pretty good. And I suspected that would be my life. And then November of that year, I got a call. There was a job at the MTA. So I went and got the job at the MTA. And I married Miss Wrong in the process of all this. And I get called to do a campaign in the Bronx for a guy named Victor Marrero, who was then the commissioner of the Department of Housing Community Renewal in the state of New York. And nobody thought we could win it. And I meet a guy named Walter Diamond, who worked for Local 237 Teamsters, run by Barry Feinstein in those years. A tough crowd. And I did the campaign. We nearly pulled it off. It was impossible to win. We nearly did that. And Diamond said to me, it was very interesting. I met him and he says, let's go get a cup of coffee. I said, I know from political people. I was a blue-collar kid. I mean, he's a guy sitting at a desk. He's the manager. He's really the economist. I didn't know what the economist was. It didn't make any sense to me. So Diamond and I go for a cup of coffee around the corner. There's a Jan's still in the South Bronx in those years. And it was the most amazing thing. He lights up a Benson & Hedges, which was a very expensive cigarette, classy. He says to the waitress, may I have a cup of coffee with cream? And she says, certainly. I said, this is terrific. I said, I'm going to get over here. The next thing I knew, then the next move is he takes out his teeth and puts them on the table. I said, now I understand I'm in politics. Because nothing's normal. So I did the campaign. We got to be friends. He said to me that I was going to be a star. I said, you must be kidding. I said, all I want to do is pick up my $300 so we can get out of here, which is a lot of money. But he gave me the opportunity to be a star. I did other campaigns that were very hard and tough. And then, I had this interesting capacity to come up with very different kinds of press angles and also very different kinds of media. And I became a media producer, helped elect Aldo Bello, lieutenant governor, started working on statewide campaigns, and knew that in order for me to make it, I would have to get out of here. In other words, get out of New York. So I got on airplanes and started traveling the country. And I worked on campaigns in 44 states. And among the things that happened was there was a guy, a Houston cop, who was here on recruit investigation. And once a cop, always a cop, as you guys know. So Mark Clark, he was the head of the Houston Police Officers Union. Then it was an association. We became friends, and suddenly I'm at the NAPO convention. The next thing I know, I'm working for cop unions in 25 states. For example, I was there during the riots in L.A., working for the Los Angeles Police Protective League. I shot ads here for the PBA when that poor cop, Dwyer, got thrown off the roof.
Right.
That ad was very powerful.
Midtown South.
Right. It was extraordinary because I felt like I belonged. I mean, I've never really felt like I belonged any place. I've been a lone wolf. I didn't have the capacity because of the way I came into the world to really form an organization. But I had skills as a writer. Reporters and I get along well. I understood how to produce ads in those years. I won a lot of awards. And the Clinton thing happened because I met Dick Morris, who's completely crazy. And I shot the first ads for Clinton in his reelection in '96. This was all the progression. And what were the ads about? The crime bill and cops. And when a cop shot, killed, line of duty death in Ohio, and I cut an ad around that with it using a cop also from Houston in the ad who'd been shot. So I never really could leave the world I came from. It was all part of my life. I couldn't leave, no matter where I traveled. I was still that experience of growing up in the South Bronx. I mean, of having nothing. I mean, really, really less than nothing. It made me a Democrat. I'm that kind of still a Democrat, a blue-collar labor union kind of guy. And I'm kind of disgraced by where the Democratic Party's gone. But these different experiences kept rolling along, and then I got off the road. My son Isaac was born. I wanted to be off the road. I mean, I worked in South Africa, for example, and I was on a plane. I'd leave on Sunday night. I get there on Monday in the afternoon, look at focus groups Monday night, write ads Tuesday, get on a plane Tuesday night and go back. When I worked in California a lot. I'd take the plane Monday morning, take the red eye back Tuesday night. That was my life. I flew 350,000 miles a year all over the world. I worked in Europe. I worked a lot in South America, a lot in the Caribbean. And but my most important experiences were, again, working for public sector unions. I helped organize teams to locals around the country. And I worked for the Alabama Education Association in the years when I had real power. And I was able to see how people really could be helped by the things we did and how they could be hurt by the things we didn't do. It was just, all these experiences were kind of, continuous and were, but if you say to me how this all happened, I have absolutely no idea.
Hank, another question. In regards to the campaigns you worked on, many, many campaigns.
700, I would guess right now.
What was your favorite campaign, or fond memory, or funny story?
The best campaigns were the ones you lose, actually, because if you're in close races that are tough, you really have to use your brains. Any idiot can win when you're 60 points up. I mean, I'm thinking about New York for your viewers and your listeners. Things we heard. The campaign in '81 against Liz Holtzman when she ran for district attorney, Walter Diamond, and I came up with a character called Goldie Abramson, who was a woman from Brooklyn, senior citizen. We put her on the air in a radio ad, and she said the most outrageous thing. She said, my friends and I, obvious implication, don't want Liz Holtzman to be the Brooklyn district attorney, and she went on and on. It was very controversial. It also moved the numbers. So what was 60 points down suddenly became a 3-point race. And when the Supreme Court that year canceled the elections on a Voting Rights Act violation because of the gerrymandering of the city council, we had the race won. And when they held it again 3 weeks later, we lost it by 3.5 points. Because he just couldn't keep it going at that. But that was very interesting. Working for Bill Clinton, shooting the first ads for Bill Clinton, and being in the room with the president or vice president, that was interesting. Being in Venezuela, I learned a lot in Venezuela about cross-cultural issues. Although I felt comfortable, I felt very comfortable always with African-American people and with Latinos, particularly Puerto Ricans, because I'd grown up in the milieu. It was normal for me. I mean, these were the people I knew. I was a South Bronx guy. Normal people, white people with money didn't make any sense to me. And when I used to get around them, or go to places where they had money, I would break into cold sweats. I remember going to interview at jobs that I knew I wouldn't get for PR companies when I was a kid. Because I really wanted to be a newspaper man. I didn't want to do this. And I'd break into cold sweats when they had air conditioning. I mean, it wasn't where I belonged. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. But the toughest races were the ones I liked. Working in Alabama was very special for me. Working for the Alabama Education Association was special. I liked that a lot. Those campaigns were good campaigns. We did legislative races up and down. It was great. In New York City, working in 2001, I thought I would win the trifecta. No one had ever done it before, all 3 citywide races. So when then 9/11 happened, but Bill Thompson became the controller. I was glad he allowed me to work for him. Betsy Gotpound became the public advocate. I had Mark Green, and I got him through the runoff, and then I was sidelined, and he lost that runoff, as we know. He won the runoff, lost the general election to Mike Bloomberg, not because of the money. They ran a crappy campaign, and that was upsetting. But it was interesting to be intricately involved in the day-to-day campaign of New York City in that way, with the kind of intensity, to understand how complicated the fabric of this town is, how interest groups work and don't work. I mean, I've worked for most of the significant interest groups in New York City at one point or another. But my home, except for a period of 13 years since I began my career, is really Local 237 Teamsters, which is the largest local in the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. My other home is the Detectives Endowment Association, where I'm grateful that the greatest detectives in the world have allowed me to work for them and have kept me around for a while. And it's been a great thing for me, and I'm very, very grateful that I've had these opportunities.
You know, getting back to the Mark Green campaign in 2001, myself along with 20 other off-duty detectives volunteered our time to provide security for him and his family, you know, to get him around.
Good.
And then, of course...
It's good, man.
Yeah,
it just didn't work out. I mean, I think what happened, it's a good story. So 9/11 happens. Devastating. I watched the second tower go down. I thought about the cops and the firefighters that were in that building, all kinds of cops, federal guys too. I mean, I could have been in there, I thought. You know, whenever I see cops get shot or things that don't make sense, I think that I could have been there. You know, it's a personal thing for me. I take it to heart. And I've known a lot of guys, unfortunately. You know, 2 guys I went to the academy with were killed in the line of duty. But 9/11 marked that opportunity in many ways because it changed the nature of the discussion. And the most important thing in political campaigns is to try to control that discussion.
Right.
So that no matter what happens, I think he's a good man. I think he would have been a reasonably good mayor. And I think 9/11 got him. But what happened was Yom Kippur, and then remember that the election was put off 3 weeks, and then the runoff occurred. And we had pagers in those years, and I picked up my pager after the fast ended, and it said emergency meeting at Mark's house. So I hop in a cab, I go over there, and he was sitting there. Next to him was the woman, Shayla Latoya, who ultimately, in the de Blasio years, became the Housing Authority Commissioner, chair rather, and they said it was a tough decision, but we made the decision. I said, what might that be? I said, I was busy. I had a previous appointment. It was called Yom Kippur, you know, fast day. And he said, well, we decided to agree to accede to Rudy's request for term extension. I said, well, here's the problem, guys. I said, he didn't request it because he didn't. It was a rumor. I said, secondarily, it's going to cost you the race. He said, how is that possible? How do you know? I said, because part of what drives political campaigns, in my experience by then, I'd had, 20 years in? More than 20 years, is the morality of the moment. The fact that police officers, dedicated detectives, the greatest detectives in the world, would provide security assistance for Mark Green tells you about the moral nature. That when we are at our best, the moral forces of the world join to create that which is good. And when we're at our worst, they create chaos. You know, and Mark, by creating chaos, cost himself that election because it wasn't accurate. And when he lost that moral argument, he was no longer the candidate that people thought he was.
True. Yep.
Well, we've gone through the progression of your career from rabbi to Port Authority, police officer, correction department, your Ph.D., and your current business. But what I'd like for you to elaborate on is your experience with law enforcement agencies, primarily because we are a law enforcement geared podcast.
Yep.
I'd like to hear more about that.
Sure.
What you've done in 25 different cities. You said.
I've worked all over the country for cop unions, and I'd like. I guess having been a cop, having the academic credentials I do, and having been around cops all my life. I mean, I tell people there's really only 3 things I understand. I don't want to get carried away. One is press, the other is police, and the third is politics. And what I do know is that the most political of all jobs is being a cop, because a cop is the first person, the first individual, and the first car or the first thing that anybody sees about government. It is what their expectations are based on. It is the relationships they create with the men and women who do that job that determines how they view government, and also in many cases, especially when it comes to poor people, it's whether life is successful or not. I saw cities where you have collective bargaining, locations where you don't have collective bargaining, and places where there is no history of police organizing. And what I learned in those experiences, I saw some of the best union leaders I've ever seen and some of the worst ones. And I saw some of the most corrupt ones and some of the most extraordinary people. What I learned in it all, and I was there for shootings. I mean, if there was a controversy, invariably I'd get a call and I'd get an airplane. The Minneapolis thing didn't happen yesterday. Gangs were shooting cops in Minneapolis a long time before that. The hostility, therefore, between the community and cops was palpable. So it's no surprise that ultimately a disaster came, which was the Floyd killing, the homicide which resulted in the changes in policing that we have yet to really understand and we have yet to really integrate into our thinking. When we look at how policing works. I also know that without policing, in a free society, there is no freedom. I saw what happens when you have ultimate chaos, which was the LA riots. I was there in '92. I was hired by the Los Angeles Police Protective League. And I remember flying from Spokane, where I'd been to meet with the Spokane Police Guild guys. That evening when the riots broke out, the smoke was so high that the plane had a problem with landing. And I knew the freeway system, so I was able to drive around the riot area, which tells you a good deal about how cities are established to provide the least amount of support for the people who need it most, and the people who have to clean up the mess are the men and women who serve with pride or the best that they can in many cases. That cops are the people that the poor see first. And they are the recipients of the anger of society that somehow, unfortunately, doesn't function where there's great riches. I mean, 15 minutes from where we're sitting is the densest poverty in the Western Hemisphere, and precincts where people are not being served properly because there aren't enough cops and there aren't enough detectives to do the work that is required. I have never seen, because of my own experience, going through doors, and I've done it, and the rest of it, I have never seen a man or woman in a blue suit or a brown suit, as in San Diego, who was not brave at the moment and did not look back. I beat civilian review for the San Diego Police Union, Police Officers Association, and the first time it was on the ballot. I worked for sheriff's unions throughout California on minimum manning issues. I worked for cop unions all over Texas, and took out the governments for them, because I found out that the only way you can enforce a contract or enforce an agreement is the threat of removing those who did not do what was appropriate for those who work for a living. Because without that threat, there is nothing. This is about a battle when it comes to collective bargaining and police officers' rights. I worked for cop unions in Maryland, again, in New York, on Long Island. The Nassau PBA hired me, along with the superiors there and the detectives, some years back to take out Tom Suozzi, ultimately. We did. I warned Suozzi when he got elected county executive the first time. I said, it'll be great as long as you don't fool with the cops. Not because I was working for him, because it's a bad move. In other words, having arguments with police and police unions is a bad gesture, because ultimately the people in power pay the price for that. Why? Because politicians come and go, but cops are there for 20 years. And without the cops, there is no free society. That is the great conflict. What is behind the shield? Niederhofer, who you worked with, Captain, understood this better than anybody. He wrote the classic book. And then we have people who are much more theoretical about it. But that relationship between police and the public they serve is best served when we have powerful and functioning police unions, because they can make sure that the work is done in a way that makes sense. That's why we need them badly. And it creates order where there could be chaos. That is very significant, I think.
Are you currently working with any police agency?
I work for the, again, I'm very proud to work for the New York City NYPD Detectives Endowment Association. I worked for all of those New York City police unions and coalition, which I was proud to do during the battle on the 50A disciplinary record release. And I think the diaphragm compression bill, which I think is an intellectual and as a New York City resident is a complete disgrace. And I once said to a politician who was arguing with me about the Diaphragm Compression Act, which prohibits putting any force between the lower sternum to the upper belly, I said, this is something I know something about. So why don't you try to lock me up, arrest me without putting pressure on that part of the body? And it's punishable after, adjudication for a cop to be punished with 90 days in the can with a misdemeanor and a $25,000 fine. You cannot expect people who are being told that they're criminals to do a job that requires them to chase criminals, for them to put themselves on the line every day with a public that, with politicians that are not forgiving and a public that desperately needs them. And that is the great, madness of it all.
Well, that's one of the most disgraceful pieces of legislation that the New York City Council engaged in. And the terrible thing is that the mayor at the time, I don't remember whether it was Adams or de Blasio.
It was de Blasio.
De Blasio didn't stand up for it.
Because he didn't understand. Again, New York and the NYPD sets the trends for the next country. That is something I learned. And I worked in Chicago. I mean, you name it, I was there. If there was a crisis, I got the call. And Boston. I mean, I helped get them a contract. They had a piece of legislation on the books dating back to the police strike of 1916 that allowed the police commissioner, the chief of police, to abrogate the collective bargaining agreement at will. I helped then President Tommy Nee defeat that. I came up with the campaign. We went on television, got a contract at the same time. When you prohibit the police from organizing, you have no means for them to vent their anger or frustration or at the table, at the collective bargaining table. When you do not give public employees the ability to bargain, you create a situation that ensures that people ultimately be unhappy. No, we're going to be unhappy anyway. The locker rooms are the worst thing that ever happened to policing, as both of you know very well. It's where the worst chatter goes on and the worst crimes are committed against character. It's the way it is. So why do you want to make that worse? Police unions make it better. They don't make it worse. I saw on television, I think it was Joy Reid and at MSNBC complaining about the power of police unions. I have the opposite view, not because I was a cop, and not because I'm a political scientist, because I'm a Ph.D. I'm rather educated and understand power. That if you don't give people the capacity to have some say in the environment around them, and nobody takes the police job to get rich. They don't take the police job because they're going to work in a hedge fund tomorrow. They don't take the police job because they want to, put on a $1,500 suit every day. They take the police job because they want to save a life, because they want to protect somebody, because they feel a higher calling. It's like being a priest or a rabbi, You have to give people in those settings the ability to organize, to have some sense of control over their environments, because without that, they can't function either, and the society does not get what it needs. That's my considered opinion as I am the expert without being arrogant.
Hank, what is your current assessment of the NYPD's mess today?
I'm very concerned as a New Yorker and as a former policeman and as a scholar, which I am. I am worried about the position, the condition of the NYPD, as I am about the condition of the New York City Probation Department, as well as the Department of Correction, as well as all of these law enforcement agencies, for a whole host of reasons. They are underpersoned. They are going through a significant transition that I'm not sure they can sustain. I think what people don't understand, because they're used to getting instant news, is that changes in major institutions take a long time to be absorbed, and that the negative things that occur take a long time to be undone. You cannot train as someone who's been through a police academy and been through the smokehouse and the firearms training and the defensive driving course and the close combat and the rest of it, okay? You cannot just tell somebody, put on this suit and go in the street. We're not going to replace the numbers that we're losing in the New York City Police Department or in these other agencies right now. And the system can't function. It is going to take a long time to restore the NYPD, and the amount of money required to put more cops on the street. We're going to have record retirements. The sergeants don't have a contract. I mean, I can't imagine knowing your job, knowing the people in it, what it is like in a house that ain't a precinct, where the sergeants their contract is so extraordinarily undone. And their white shields are making, the patrol officers are making more money in many cases and stand to make more money over the term. I can't imagine what that's like. I mean, there's an order to things that is so out of order that you certainly understand this. And if it's not put back in order, there will be chaos. Why? Guys will react. And the general sense that who wants that job today? I'll guarantee you that there will be record retirements starting on January 1, 2025 through the end of the year. Why? Not because of overtime. The press will say it's overtime. That's not it. You wouldn't have the amount of overtime if you had the appropriate number of police officers, which you don't have. So a commander can't move bodies around. You have sectors that are uncovered or undermanned, I guarantee. And it is particularly acute in certain commands. Where are the commands that have these problems? Where they're most needed. And that is a terrible comment in our society.
The average precinct is down 50%, I'm sure. I know the detective squads are down, and the workload in the detective squads is unbelievable. It's overwhelming.
I'm very distressed by it. I think that, they don't make movies about other police departments generally. They don't make heroes. I have never seen a cop, and again, I've been there. I've never seen a police officer who was not brave, man or woman. I've never seen the guys with the biggest mouths who complain about cops run into burning buildings. I've never seen people or politicians run into the World Trade Center.
True.
Put their lives on the line and put on a vest and have to make a decision in a moment that can change the lives of many people. I knew a cop that got killed in the Port Authority bus terminal. There's a homeless guy. Told him to go away. He was on post. Go away. He was on post. Go away. Next thing you know, the guy's on top of him. And I've been at this movie where you're waiting for the posse to show up because you're rolling around the floor, which you guys have too. That's what you did. Except this didn't work out so well. Homeless guy grabs the cop's gun, shoots him. 2 cops show up, shoot him, which means that in a matter of 10 to 15 seconds, the lives of 4 people, plus the families that they're related to, and their extended families, are changed forever. It is very hard for people who don't understand that this is not a movie to understand what that means. If we multiply that and we think about what the streets are like today, it's only a matter of time before we have more homeless people who are unfortunately need treatment,
Right.
that are going to get engaged with cops in situations that are dangerous. And the cops will be blamed for whatever the behavior is, rather than saying, what are the politicians doing about it? And that tension between politics and policing is not new. And I've seen it every place I've worked. And I've worked in Canada. I've done this stuff for cops in 25 states, and I've worked on political campaigns in, I guesstimate, 40 states at every level, from state assembly, city council, or state house of representatives to president of the United States, governors, senators, congressmen.
Cap?
Hank, our current mayor,
Yeah.
who spent 22 years in law enforcement and rose to the rank of captain, I believe he's been an abject failure. And you can read in the papers what's going on in the police department now, and the people that he hired his cronies without vetting them.
Sure.
No committees, and a lot of them are in trouble. Some of them may
Sure.
go to jail. What is your assessment of the mayor's handling of the police department and the issues that arise?
I think of this in 2 ways. I think that what people need to understand is that when a program or a policy is put into place, it is very difficult to rescind that policy or program, and it takes a long time. To be fair to Adams, he inherited a terrible set of circumstances. Away from the George Floyd homicide, he inherited an anti-cop bias among the people governing the city, a depletion of resources, the city's capital budget was completely washed out. There was no money. It was just the De Blasio years were not good, and they were awful generally, and inherited a bunch of promises about affordable housing and the lasting effect of the pandemic, the COVID pandemic. That doesn't mean that you can allow the police department, the jewel of New York City, to fall into complete disarray. And part of that disarray is the retirement levels that we have, and you can't replace that kind of experience. For guys like you who've been on that job and seen it, it is a complete, it's got to be dismal and absolutely debilitating. It's going to take a long time to repair the damage. Because again, institutions require time to be repaired. The police department, it always struck me as, my dissertation was all about the Catholic Church and its significant changes as a power player in New York City politics. And in the interest of disclosure, I've worked for the Catholic Conference of the State of New York and the Brooklyn Diocese, and proudly so. Institution that looks like the church, you can't make change that fast. You have a pope called the commissioner. You have all the cardinals and the rest called the chiefs. It takes a long time to make change occur. It's going to take years to repair this institution. It's not going to happen overnight, and you're going to have to spend an extraordinary amount of money to hire people, to train them properly, so that the greatest police department in the world, and the greatest detectives in the world can get back to doing what they know how to do, which is to be the best New Yorkers we need. Again, it's going to take a long time. I think it's a terrible mess. Terrible mess. And that's someone who deals with cops all day long.
Hank, one last question.
Sure.
What's your take on the next mayor's race?
We are in late January or mid-January of 2025. The mayoral race will occur in June. The Democratic primary, although I'm starting to become a believer in nonpartisan elections, by the way. Mike Bloomberg wanted it. He was right, I think. Will be decided in June. There is no good news coming out of Eric Adams' life right now. The leak by the federal authorities, which was obvious to me, that he is likely to be indicted again on what would appear to be witness tampering, is very significant. If the race were held today, it would be Andrew Cuomo 1, Brad Lander, the controller, 2, probably Scott Stringer, the former controller, 3, and Eric Adams, 4. It is a terrible, terrible, terrible moment for New York to witness this mayor being castigated in some ways unfairly and falling prey to his own loyalties. I think that he's in very serious trouble. It is very hard to see today how he gets reelected.
Do you think Cuomo will run?
I think Andrew Cuomo will run. People will attack him, but you can't attack 11 on-time budgets. You can't attack rebuilding a bridge. You can't attack rebuilding 2 airports. He'll create a new relationship with law enforcement that is not overly positive nor overly negative, but down the middle, because he understands the crisis. And he will be attacked. But again, if you look at the history of governors in New York State, what I call the imperial governors that function the best, going back to Nelson Rockefeller, who built the state university system, built the campus in Albany for the legislature, rebuilt the thruway system, did it his own way. Hugh Carey, who said to New York City, if you don't fix your finances, I'm taking over. And he did what he had to do and effectively took it over. George Pataki, who said, let's get it done my way, and did it very nicely, okay? And Andrew Cuomo. You cannot have a governor that governs without some sense of friction between people who see his power as being overwhelming or not. So Andrew Cuomo will be attacked. Is he what we need right now? If Eric Adams is re-indicted, he's exactly what we need right now.
Okay.
What about Curtis Sliwa?
A very good person. I think a very historical figure. The Transit Police Benevolent Association didn't much like him when he first went into the subways, understandably so. Do I think that he represents the everyman in New York City? The answer is yes. Has that everyman changed? One of the wonders of New York City is that you can have unions like the laborers that are becoming more Ecuadorian, more new immigrant. Why? Because not everybody wants to go into buildings and demolish them and live with asbestos. But they're taking over neighborhoods like Maspeth and Ridgewood. Okay, why? Because they can, because that's the great gift of New York. So those are people that may vote for Curtis Sliwa. But I would bet that it will be very difficult for him should Andrew Cuomo be the nominee to defeat Andrew Cuomo.
Well, Hank, thank you for being our guest today. I mean, we should have a part 2 and 3 with you because you're a very, very interesting person, and you've done some great work through the years, and you have some great stories, and you really know what you're talking about. So that's fantastic.
I'm the luckiest guy in the world. I owe it to this city, and I owe it to the entity that watches over all of us. And I wish you all safety and success.
And I'm very happy you're working with my union, the DEA, Detective Endowment Association.
Well, I'm very grateful to that board and to President Scott Monroe for keeping me around, and I hope they will for many years, and I hope I won't disappoint them at any time soon.
Thank you. Cap?
Well, I think this has been an extremely interesting interview. Your career is fascinating.
Thank you.
I expect to see you marrying somebody one of these days.
Well, I think I'm the luckiest guy in the world.
And to make a point, you talked about your brother in Israel in the Golan Heights. Well, my grandson recently went to Israel. He's now in the IDF. He's a captain.
God should protect him.
So I'm concerned about him because I know things are tough over there. But it's what he wanted to do.
It's a calling like anything else. You know, being a police officer is a calling. Right. Being an IDF officer is a calling.
Hank, if any of our listeners would like to get in touch with you, how could they do that?
They could just email me, hank@sheinkopf.com, SHEINKOP as in Paul, F as in Frank.com. My pleasure.
Great. Thank you, Hank. I'd like to thank our guest today, Hank Sheinkopf. Thank you so much for being here. And I'd like to thank everyone for listening. And if you like what you hear, please subscribe to Cop Talk. And you could also follow us on X at Cop Talk WABC. That's at Cop Talk WABC. And until next time, God bless you. God bless America. God bless law enforcement throughout the world. And also, God bless our U.S. military. Cap?
And you can also follow this section on this segment on YouTube.
Thank you. Until next time, be safe out there.